Hi, everybody. This is Rolf Moore. I'm co-chair with Cora Santa Guida of the Green Party of Connecticut, the Fairfield County chapter. And I just wanted to share some observations of two of the mayoral candidate forums that I attended recently. The first one at Ripplewam High School and the last one at the Government Center. And I thought what was interesting was the two overarching themes had to do with the economy of Stamford and also education. Speaking to the first one, I thought it was kind of interesting about this interest, the emphasis on the prospect that Amazon might be relocating to Stamford. Many cities around the country are in a bidding war to entice them to relocate here. And what I thought was kind of surprising and kind of elicited a chuckle from me was that the prospective site for Amazon would be the empty building that was first built on what used to be the city's boatyard for a Bridgewater hedge fund, which decided in the end, after all the hemming and hawing, all the concessions, to stay in Westport. So this building was established at the cost of the city's boatyard, jeopardizing maritime safety for people in Stamford and the surrounding coastal communities. What's ironic about it, though, is that Bridgewater, as a hedge fund, as the world's largest hedge fund, would not really be, as far as I'm concerned, a going interest to support in Stamford from an economic standpoint, because 80% of most hedge funds fail anyway. Things are not really that much better for Amazon, as it is a prime player in what's emerging as the tech economy. Amazon, of course, started during the rise of the internet in the 90s. But as the incumbent mayor, David Martin, emphasized in one of the debates, it has a lot of revenue behind it, which would, of course, accrue well for Stamford residents. But revenue is not the same thing as profits, and this is a distinction that the whole tech economy seems to rest on to generate a lot of hype and a lot of interest. Revenue, of course, has to do with people investing in a company, and this has really been the prime engine for Amazon's growth and expansion over the years. Not so much its profits, but its revenues. Indeed, according to Dan Lyons, the former tech editor with Newsweek, he pointed out in his book Disrupted, which is another buzzword used to get people excited about these sort of companies, that they're supposed to be so transformative in what they do, addressing software development for cell phones, computers, and the like. He pointed out that maybe 2 or 3 quarters over the years are the only times that Amazon's actually shown a concrete profit. And a lot of companies now are operating this way, such as HubSpot, which is the place that Lyons was working on in the book Disrupted. If you want to check it out or look him up online, his last name is spelled Lyons. And these companies operate on the basis of getting mom and pop investors to pour their money into these companies, and they grow really fast, but they don't necessarily have legs, because the technology they develop might be ephemeral, or it doesn't really lead to anything. Remember Google Glass, for instance, that never went anywhere, so Google doesn't talk about it anymore. But the point is that people that found these companies, they move on very quickly before things collapse and start up again, and they depend a lot on a labor pool of employees that are 30 or younger. And this ties in very well with the mayor's prescription for redefining the curriculum at Stamford UConn, with the promise of more students coming in through the new residence being built here. That would be working for these companies that don't live here yet, that are part of this innovation corridor, that prescription that they have for Stamford. Now, this would be great labor for them, cheap labor, because they would be interns, so they would essentially be working for nothing. But the problem is, as Lyons and economist Michael Hudson point out, this constitutes one of the next major economic bubbles that are going to burst in the next couple of years or so. So I don't see how it's in Stamford's interests that we host such an organization, such a company in Stamford. Now, preceding this, of course, is UBS and RBS and the problems that developed with them. UBS in particular, they pretty much left town, and they were threatening to leave a few years ago, and Governor Malloy, former mayor of Stamford, of course, offered them what he referred to as a non-refundable loan of $20 million to entice them to stay in Stamford, and they left anyway. And he did this at the same time, incidentally, that rates were increased, fares were increased for Metro North and Connecticut Transit, and services were being cut back. On top of that, UBS is particularly notorious because of the scandal that occurred when one of their own employees, Bradley Birkenfeld, went to jail for about 40 months simply because he blew the whistle on the fact that they had a department devoted to helping the wealthy evade paying their taxes. It had gotten so egregious, even he couldn't take it anymore. So he went to jail. However, the president of the bank ended up being appointed by Obama to become part of a new committee that would have oversight over investment banks to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen. So it's kind of a scenario. It's not so much the fox guarding the hen house, it's foxes watching other foxes that have their eyes on the hen house. So this is the kind of thing that we've had that's just totally been extractive, not only to Stamford's economy, but has had an impact, of course, nationwide. Contrary to Martin's assertion, and really a bipartisan consensus throughout the state, that Connecticut needs to be more friendly to these corporations is ridiculous because we've been doing nothing but accommodating them at our own expense. On the more local level, we have more regional formations like the Downtown Special Services District, which also operates on a similarly extractive basis. Now, it's done much, of course, for Bedford Street. We have all these high-ticket restaurants and bars and so on, which serve primarily clientele that come in from these corporations, and one wonders how long these people that are frequent these places are going to even be in town if the corporation decides to up and leave again, if they don't get yet another concession, another subsidy from us, tax abatement, and so on. But because they have a lot of income, they're willing to pay a lot of money for food and drink. That raises the cost of living for people that already live here. So the solution, that the bipartisan solution, is to do more of the same, which is, of course, insane. What we really need to do is to start investing in one another. A good example of why DSSD is kind of extractive is that, we have in a couple of weeks the balloon parade coming up. At Bedford Street and Broad Street and so on. However, every year the bleachers that are rented for people to watch the parade are rented from a company not in Stamford, not in Norwalk, not in Fairfield County, but in New Jersey. Because, of course, the profit margin is better there if you use a company from elsewhere than in this expensive area. It's great for DSSD, but of course it's at the cost of the economy of Stamford because you're hiring people that aren't spending their money here because they're not invested here. They don't live here. So if you're hiring local businesses that are employed by people that live in the area, they spend their money here. So that helps other businesses here. So the mandate, the constant mantra that we got to grow the economy is insane because, of course, you can see how physically we're having infrastructural problems and so on. So much overgrowth. We know what's going on in Glenbrook and Springdale, all this construction going on. That's because I imagine it's overflow because there's so much housing needed for all these employees that come in from out of town. So what we need is not an economy that grows. We need one that's reciprocal. That is, we have to stop investing in these corporations and stop with this ridiculous hang-up that we have to meet the desires of New York or Wall Street or whoever, and start investing in one another. Even Fortune magazine last month warns of the dangers of what it terms bending over backwards for corporations. You could do a search online to find the article. It particularly cites what's going on around the country. One town, I think, is even willing to rename its town Amazon as a favor if the company relocates there. But it's a question of understanding what our values should be as a community, understanding, as I said, the reciprocal nature of economy. And it does cite an interesting alternative. For instance, if you're going to talk about things high tech, Knoxville, Tennessee has its own publicly run public service. It's run as a public utility. It's called the Gig. It's an internet service provider. It provides service far faster than commercial providers and is much less expensive. Unfortunately, the prescription for Connecticut is to use the same consultant that was hired to develop what they call the Gig in Knoxville and come up with a pro-corporate version with a lot of private investment. So it's going to be to the benefit of big corporations, whereas in Knoxville it's to the benefit of local businesses. Cooperative ventures of this kind, these are really the prescriptions for developing a truly autonomous, resilient economy, especially with there's so much economic instability, and in particular in the case of Connecticut, the fact that Hartford is likely to file for bankruptcy. This is according to economist Michael Hudson. And this, of course, gets into the question of education, its financing, and so on. And again, we have the same problem of the outsourcing craze that is making education so unequal and expensive in Connecticut, in particular in Stamford, rather. We finally, after years and years, have gotten rid of AFB management, which was managing the school's facilities and had oversight over the school employees that maintained the grounds and the buildings and so on, which was just really expensive and calls into question why the city can't do this itself. But now we have another company in its stead. Selection of school superintendents, of course, for years, the city hires an outside consultancy to bring somebody from out of state. The current superintendent comes from New Jersey. The question is, why is it that we don't have an election of people working in the schools who are interested in this position, principals and so on, who actually know what the educational landscape and the needs of the students in at least one part of the city understand this intimately. My contention is that to maintain an unequal educational landscape, because of course the problem with education, the reason it's so expensive, is that it's tied in with property taxes, and property taxes are based on where you live. So of course schools in more affluent areas of town have more benefits than those in poorer parts of town. It extends even to hiring a company, a consultancy, to come up to facilitate the naming of the new magnet school in Strawberry Hill. Why can't we do this for ourselves? It's absurd. But at least in this case, it was done through an anonymous donor, but it still has the same mentality behind it. Now, speaking as a voter, of the three candidates, there is one that's unaffiliated, John Zito, and I find that he appears to be the only one interested in addressing these issues and supporting genuine local business development. Remember, Stamford, I believe Martin mentioned about how Yale and Town was a big employer in Stamford. They made locks. But we have to get back to generating local business development here. These big corporations, if they're so great, they've originated somewhere. Why is it nothing big or something really influential isn't developing here? Stamford, for instance, back in I think the late 1800s or early 1900s, actually manufactured its own automobiles. Two brothers started a company and they made what was known as the Stammobile. There are very few records about it. There aren't any photos available. But that's what I would consider a good example of local business development. Zito understands this concept, and he understands he's demonstrated an awareness of what's going on with the city and this waste that's been plaguing it for so long, and the importance of a reciprocal economic basis. In particular, what struck me at the last debate is that he's interested in public input, as opposed to the two bipartisan candidates, the Republican and the Democrat, who keep talking about the standard prescriptions for the current problems, which really only serve to make them worse in the long run. All right, well, I hope to see you at the polls. Of course, that's July. What am I talking about? This Tuesday, November 7th, is Election Day. And the Green Party in Stamford is three candidates. Jackie Pioli is running for Board of Education. Brian Merlin, who is running for Board of Representatives in District 7. And Cora Santaguida is running for Constable. If you want to find out more information about our candidates, please go to ctgreenparty.org. All right, well, thanks for your time.